Good evening, everybody. My name is Craig Lawrence Rice. Hope you're going to enjoy this. This is a great opportunity, and our event is called We the People. This series of conversations is stimulated by films that were selected. So again, thank you for joining us. There's a Q&A button at the bottom. If there are questions you want specifically to be asked of any of the people on the panel, please type them in. I'll get to them at the appropriate time. I want to thank you for doing this. I want to thank, first of all, I want to thank the members of the Film Society for their support in bringing this program to us. If you're not a member, please join. It's mspfilm.org. It's mspfilm.org. I also want to thank our sponsors here for supporting this, Penny and Bill George Foundation, Kelly and Mike Palmer, and Knock for their support of this event. This evening, we have a film that is, I was totally unaware of it until it really hit me, and they said, you should see this film, which I'm so glad that I did. It's called Sound of Redemption, the Frank Morgan story. It's an incredible piece of work, and I'm really glad that we have some people here that were involved in this project, and I'm going to introduce them in a minute here. I'm actually going to start with the musicians first. Grace Kelly is waving there. She's a musical prodigy. I know people say that and throw that around, but this is a true deal. She's got 13 albums behind her. She's been a sax player, a songwriter. She's actually did the 2009 inauguration for Barack Obama at 16. She's also played with a solo with the Boston Pop at 14. She's played with Dave Brubeck, Bill Woods. She's played with Harry Connick Jr., Gloria Estefan. She's played with Abe Snarky Puppy. I mean, the list goes on. She's actually, it was in Vanity Fair as a millennial shaking up the jazz world. So this is somebody that I know that we're going to hear about tonight. And if you've seen the movie, if you haven't, please see it. You definitely will be impressed by her playing. We also have George Gables. George is, he's a true New Yorker. He went to the Fame School. I don't know why they called that other than the movie, but the High School of Performing Arts. He's played with everybody. Herbie Hancock, Chick Corea. He's played with Sonny Rollins. He's played with Joe Henderson, Freddie Hubbard, and a friend that I knew, unfortunately, is no longer with us, Art Pepper. I think that's an incredible resume for any musician to be able to say those kinds of names. And again, the list goes on and on and on and on and on with him. This person, I've already gave him my laurels here, is Sir Ron Carter. He's a master bass player with over 2,000 albums to his credit. He's played with everybody that was in jazz, everybody that was ever in jazz, including the blues, B.B. King, Weston Montgomery. He's played with Miles Davis. He's played in contemporary worlds with Aretha Franklin and Tribe Called Quest. He tours half the year. He's done film scores for a number of feature films. He's also been an educator, which I think is also a tribute to his ability to play and to perform. We also have with us somebody who I think was novel, and it was actually NC that told me who this gentleman was. Michael Conley, who is a writer, 35 novels. He wrote Harry Bosch, the series, and also Lincoln Lawyer, and he was a newspaper writer, and I'm a Harry Bosch fan, and we're going to talk about that. So, and the only reason I watched Harry Bosch is because of the music. So that's, so it's like, it's a good film, but I would never watch it if I wasn't for the music there. So NC is the director. She is an incredible director. She's directed everything from musical theater. She's got writing credits that include musical theater writing plus screenwriting. She's just finished her film in 2009. It was called Kim Jong-Ilya.
Kim Jong-Ilya.
Kim Jong-Ilya. It's a documentary about North Korea refugees. It was premiered at Sundance, and she's actually working on a film about an inmate at San Quentin. She can't get out of there. So, that's actually, I guess a lot of people are saying that about San Quentin, but it's great that you're doing this kind of a film and this kind of work. I want to kind of get into this. Got a lot of guests, but I do want to get to asking some questions. For me, jazz is the music of improvisation. It's about emotion, inspiration, and passion. It's about creating in the moment. It's about music by one soul to other souls. So I think the power of that is there. I want to talk about what inspired this film. And Michael, since my understanding is that you sort of brought the inspiration to this to NC. Is that correct? Oh, your mic's not on. Your mic.
I feel like I'm along for the ride on this because I got NC interested in it, and then I kind of sat back and it kind of happened. But I didn't know Frank the way these musicians knew him pretty well and played with him. But late in his life, I got to know him a little bit, and I did a few things with him. And he was in the stage of his life where he wanted to give back and tell his story. And then the timing was wrong. He passed away. So I talked to NC about it and said, there's a good story here. She had just done Kim Jong-Ilya, and I was impressed by that. So I said, she had not heard of Frank. She said, I'll check it out. And then a few months later, she said, you're right. I think there's a story here. It went from there. And that's the end of my involvement, really. Other than I did ask Ron Carter to join the band. That was a key thing.
I was off for 2 weeks.
Right. You reached out to the musicians. But was the inspiration for you because it was about jazz, or was it about his story?
Well, I had heard about Frank's return, basically, about the time I was putting together this character of Harry Bosch, the detective, and I wanted him to listen to jazz. I wanted jazz to be part of his character. And there's a story in Time magazine about Frank coming back and a wonderful album that come out. And it just so happened he was, the day I read that Time magazine article, he was playing at a bar in LA called the Catalina. So I went to see him play live, and then I went back the next 2 nights. And so he became part of the character of Harry Bosch. I would say he was one of his favorite musicians, and I mentioned him in the books. And kind of went from there. Then word got back to Frank about it, and so we met and so forth. And his story is one of resilience and perseverance, and then finally having it pay off. And that's very much what happens in my books with characters that I write about. So there was a strong connection there, and that's why I brought it to NC. Great.
NC, as a director, the first thing you got to do is find out your approach, what inspires you to in this approach, this visual approach to the story, and then kind of structuring that. Where did that come from for you? Were you into jazz at this time in your life, or is this a new experience?
I have been into jazz, in different parts of my life. I wasn't at that moment particularly, but I just started by listening to Frank, and that was, I was sold right away. I mean, he's an exceptional player. And there was a lot of story in his music. I could feel that. But then, I basically Googled the broad outlines of his story, and pretty dramatic stuff. But, there are a lot of jazz players who succumb to heroin. So I thought, what's going to make this different? And what's the approach here? And the thing that really got me was the fact that he spent so much time in San Quentin, in various prisons, but mostly San Quentin. And it turns out that he, as it shows in the film, he played with a big band in San Quentin that was comprised of all these amazing musicians who had the same problem as he did, which was heroin. And that this big band actually had a reputation. And I thought, this was, for me, the most magical thing you could imagine, of these guys who were so incredibly talented being stuck in there, but finding a way to free themselves out of it with the music. So I was looking for a way to show that, and there's absolutely zero archival material on this. Someday someone will go down in the basement of San Quentin and find tapes. I'm sure of it, but no one would do that with me or for me. So I it's somewhere, out of the blue, that's how these ideas come. I just had the idea of putting the band together and taking them in and doing our own version of that live event, that kind of the thing that he must have done many times. And it turned out to be so beyond anything any of us were prepared for that we just knew we had, we had lightning in a bottle there. It was amazing.
Yeah, I think the
You
whole
guys are
San,
all going to attest to that, huh?
yeah, I was going to ask them. I was going to say the rest of you guys, because the San Quentin thing is such it's such a propellant. It's a linkage in the story. I mean, the live concert that you performed, but also how it relates to his life. And what was it like for you guys as musicians to play in this kind of environment? Ron or George or Grace, jump in here.
I played I'd gone to prisons with Freddie Hubbard, played in prisons, not been an inmate, but I had played in prisons.
You got to clear that up, right?
with Freddie Hubbard, and again with Art Pepper, and I'd had that experience before. And I could tell you this, after playing in Lompoc with Freddie, I had sometime later was playing in Concerts by the Sea in Los Angeles, in Redondo Beach, outside of Los Angeles. And a young man came up to me, and he was dressed in a suit and tie, very proper. And he said, I saw you. I was in Lompoc when you played, and I just want to thank you for that, because, when we're there, they put you away, and you think the world has forgotten about you. And when he told me that, I never forgot that. So going into San Quentin was a little different. I mean, it was a little more dramatic, because when you hear those gates clink and clang, that's serious. And we got a little tour of some of the other parts of the prison, so that we could see some of the solitary, some of the places that people would have to spend solitary. And that was pretty dramatic for us. So when we played there and met the inmates who were helping us, we had some conversations, and it was very personal, but believe me, it was a very personal thing, playing there, a very dramatic thing, playing inside, because it wasn't just your imagination. You're left to it wasn't just watching a prison film or reading a book about prison. You were there, and it's a serious, serious prison. So playing music for them and watching their reaction was really moving. I can say, I think for everybody, but I can certainly speak for myself.
Yeah, Ron, what were your thoughts about it? Or Sir Ron Carter, sorry.
That's okay. Well, I, like George, have had experience playing in for the incarcerated, and like George, I've met some of the people whom I played for and locked up. At some point, I played at the prison in New Jersey, and it's really like really a real prison. And on the way out, one of the prisoners said that he was a bass player, and could I get him a bass? I said, well, I'll see what I can do. So I was at the time I was working with Larry Coryell, who had just got an endorsement with Ovation. So I said, Larry, this prisoner I met asked me if I could get him a bass. Well, I don't have one. You endorsing this big? Can you have them give me one at half price so I can get it to this guy? Because I'm not sure even they will let it in. Well, ultimately they didn't give it to him, so I went to Manny's. Went on Manny's on 48th Street, and I told her, I said, look, I need the bass for my friend who's incarcerated. How can we get this bass to him? Well, they said, well, Mr. Carter, we'll take care of it. Yeah, okay. I said, yeah, right. So ultimately they did take care of it. And about a few years later, I'm at Bradley's. I look, John in New York that's now closed, and this guy walks up to me and tells me, I don't know you, but my friend, who's a bass player, told me that if I ever saw you, I should bow down to you, because I said that he told me that you told him he would get him a bass, and he did, and that saved the last few years of his life from really getting down and inside. And like George, when we left, the closing of those doors was so final. It was hard for me to get my head wrapped around that those guys are still there, and some of them have been there for a very, very long time. We into the 15, 20 years worth of that sound, you know. When I first came to New York and worked with some guys, heroin was a really big thing. And one of their bywords was, "This guy just went to the slammers," and the reason they called it that because when the doors slammed, it was slammers. That was it, you know? And that became their communal line about who now got busted. Having said that, also when I came to New York, there was something called the Cabaret Law, and that was a law put by the police force that anyone who played where they were sold alcohol could not have been arrested for any kind of drug usage. So every musician who came to New York during that period of time, mid-50s up until like maybe 59 or 60 or so, had to go down to the police station, take a mug shot and the fingerprints, and you get a card that said you could work at any place in New York that sold liquor, any jazz club in particular. And many wonderful players who got stuck in that turnstile never played the Birdland or the Embers or those rooms because they ran afoul of the law, and that they could, and because they saw alcohol there, they couldn't play. And I'm at this concert in San Q, and I'm looking at the audience, and how many of these guys are who don't belong here, you know? And the most I can give them is some great bass lines, because when I'm gone, I hope they can remember that stuff. And I didn't sleep really well for the next 2 or 3 weeks because I could hear the doors closing, and it's just the fact that. That those guys were still there, man, you know, and that they were hanging on to our music like a lifeline in the storm, man, and they were so needy of this respite, you know, despite what was going on inside. This was a chance for them to see some pleasant clouds, you know. Just the vibe was so electric, you know, and man, I just. Even now, it's hard to get that image moved over to the side because I can still hear that sound in my head. And I'm leaving, going to my car, or going to the parking lot, and I realize that those guys who were so desperate for this music live, I don't know when they will hear it again. And I may not be here to help them hear it again. It's too much for me to handle. And I've kind of decided that I will think carefully about doing it again because it just took my spirit, man. It took me a while to get back to my.
Well, I think you're talking about the cabaret laws, stuff like that, and we're going to get into that in a little bit when we get into sort of Frank's journey here. But I wanted to get Grace to talk about it. You were, I don't know how old you are, but I know you're younger than the rest of us online here. So how was it for you being in that scenario?
I mean, Craig, I was 16 years old when we were filming this, and I had never been to any type of prison before, and I had no idea what to expect. Walking in, I was really nervous. I think there's some B-roll footage of of my face when we were getting instructions of what, protocol and colors to wear or not wear on our shirts. And so I just didn't, I don't know, I was just walking in, and I guess my first emotional experience was meeting some of these guys, these inmates who were helping us set up, like right away, just, hey, can I help you move that chair? And like so excited for this show. And some of these guys just started talking to me and telling me their story, and how long they'd been there. And I remember one guy saying, I miss my baby girl, my daughter. I haven't seen her since she was, 16 years old. And and I didn't ask any questions, but all these stories were coming, and it was like, wow. Meanwhile, getting ready for the show, which, by the way, was the first time that this incredible band that I felt just so honored, so excited to be a part of with these legendary musicians, also here on Zoom, these legendary musicians. And George, I think you were the only one I had previously made music with, because that goes back to when I first met you when I was 14 at the Betty Carter Jazz Institute, and you were the one who actually introduced me to Frank for the first time. And Frank, and then I got on stage and I played with him, and I'm going in circles here. And it was the first time I was meeting Michael Connelly, and everything was so full circle. So you have to imagine that in my own skin, there was an incredible new experience in front of me that I was trying to like take in. And then emotionally, I was missing Frank so much because he was like, I was just so close with him. And trying to play this song, Somewhere Over the Rainbow, I was literally fighting back tears just because of where we were, what it meant, what we were doing, the response, you know, and the musicians on stage, just the whole thing. And I remember I went home and I was just I had so much emotion inside that I wrote a song, just based upon this experience, because I didn't know how to say it in words. And it was just, and the song ended up, it was called He Shot a Man, which I recorded on a past album. And actually, it's going to make a revival in a album I'm working on right now with a bunch of other music as well. But it's kind of like a suite, because it goes through so many different musical pieces, and it ends with a very melancholy blues part that is kind of a yearning and a crying out. And that was the only way that I actually knew how to like get those feelings out afterwards, because it was, well, it was one of the most powerful moments in my musical life and in my life. And yeah, so that, you know, it was
But that's part of what being, I mean, from a jazz musician or jazz person's life is to express yourself emotionally, get that stuff out in writing songs. And I mean, you know, some music, I mean, obviously it's there in rock and R&B and classical music, but primarily jazz is that. That's the tunnel from what it is that you feeling out into an audience. So writing that is an outlet for you. So it was there. You had been around Frank a lot, so you did a great job of that song. I mean, you can see that in the film. And again, that's one of the high points of the film, is when you're playing that song and you're seeing the audience reaction to that. I mean, first of all, they're stone quiet and people are just absorbing this, you know, and it's almost tearful for people because there's something that radiates in their lives, you know. Something that it's a longing and a look towards the future for some of them, hopefully. I just thought it was beautiful. One thing about, you know, it's almost, I think jazz artists, when you put them in a film, you know, jazz music, there's some kind of a sort of a love or some kind of connection to those kind of characters, that kind of music that enhances a story. And I mean, this is something that when you were doing this, is this something that you sort of sorted out the music before you did this, or did the music kind of come to you, or how did that happen?
I picked things that I truly loved of Frank's, which, you know, that was hard to sort through, but there were things that just stayed with me, and I thought, this is gonna say this here. I just can feel this is gonna be good at this moment. And most of the time it worked out. And with George, we worked out all the different songs we would play in the concert at San Quentin. And it just, that moment of Grace coming out and playing Over the Rainbow was, I mean, that was very intentional to build to this moment. I knew where I was going in the story, you know, and I knew what moment in Frank's life it was meant to represent. And the other thing about that song, of course, is that everyone in the entire universe and beyond knows it. So when it starts, the introduction starts, and the guys, you know, they're just listening. They're already completely captivated because this beautiful young girl has walked out onto the stage. They're like, oh, you know, this is, I mean, more magic than that you cannot have. And then when the tune kicks in and they recognize it, you just see this ripple go through them, and they're back being 5 years old or whatever it was. That every one of them in there probably had a memory of that, knowing that song. And plus, of course, the song itself is one of the greatest ever written, and Grace's rendition was, you know, beyond. And so that, you know, I built up to it. I didn't know if it would be that amazing, but it did turn out to be that amazing. I think there were moments where where Frank is completely low, he's completely crushed. And come Sunday kind of worked for that. It's not that that song sounds completely crushed. It sounds very spiritual and full of, you know, help me out of this, God. That's what I hear in that song. I don't know. I just, it was kind of, I don't want to say that I improvised, but it was, you just feel things, you know, and then say, wow, that's going to work there. And it did. I wanted to be sure to give Frank his voice, his musical voice, which isn't always easy in a film. A long improvisation in a film is pretty hard to pull off. So there aren't that many long improvisations, but nevertheless, when you hear Frank playing the head of a tune and maybe, you know, his first round of improv, there's just so much in it every time that, you know, it worked with very little, you know, the visuals were, I didn't have to search too far. They could be fairly lyrical, the visuals, to just let that music be heard.
Yeah, one thing you said when we talked earlier was about that it was the sound of a person's soul, which I think is pretty adequate to say that, because I think that's what that performance is. It's really his soul was speaking to you and the audience and the other people that were there at the time. So that's great. I wanted to talk to Michael. We haven't ignored you here, Michael. So there's something about your work and music, and specifically jazz music. Where does that come from? Is it that you work on that in your writing work, or do you write to this type of music? There's something there. Obviously you have a connection to it.
Well, I do believe a fictional character, you know, has to have a musical identity. And, you know, I chose jazz for Harry Bosch. I can't say I was that experienced with jazz. It was more my father's music, but I wanted to give that to Harry. And so I came to writing novels from being a newspaper man. So I know how to research, I know how to look for things, and I know how to ask questions. And that's what I was doing. And that's how I came up with his musical identity. And it really came down to one song, which George wrote, called Lullaby, that Frank recorded a few times in different ways. And that became the anthem for the character of Harry Bosch, because it's got everything. It's in some ways it's sad, but in some ways it has that perseverance and hope in it. And you know, for many years I played that song at the beginning of my writing day to get into Harry Bosch mode. It was like, you know, raising the flag. I would play Lullaby, and then I would go about my work as a writer. And so that, you know, you do a lot of stuff that I'm sure musicians do. You do a lot of stuff to get you into the right space, and somehow it bleeds into what you create, you know. So, you know, I wasn't like saying I need a jazz song here. I just wrote about a guy who I hope embodies what jazz brings to people.
Great. And one of the things, I just have a question here from one of our viewers that they were talking about Taos, New Mexico. Frank was there a lot, and they were asking why was there so much little mention of him there, since that's where he's buried, apparently. His ashes are there. And that, as a filmmaker, obviously you can't put everything in, but was this an important element, the Southwest area for him?
It was an important moment in his life. Yeah, he was there for about 7 years, but I couldn't find, actually, the guy in the film named Eric Gladstone.
I think
who
he's here.
Film. Huh?
I think he's here. I see him in the chat.
Oh yeah. Hey, Eric.
Hey, Eric.
So he has it's like the banner quote in the beginning of the film, which is that he started following about Frank, or he heard about Frank because he was a jazz fan. He went to these late night shows in LA. I mean, I can say this by heart. He went to these late night shows in LA, and somebody said to him, if you want to hear, this is dedicated to the greatest sax player in the world, Frank Morgan, but if you want to hear him, you have to go up to San Quentin. And it just, so Eric became like very attached to this idea of Frank in San Quentin. He was up in San Francisco and he would kind of pass the prison and think about Frank. And he actually started a jazz festival in Frank's name in Taos after this film came out. So Frank lives on in Taos, but I didn't have other people, like there was a woman he was living with there who I just couldn't get a hold of. I would have done an interview with her and I might have had a scene there, but I just couldn't get a hold of her.
Yeah.
So that's why it's not in.
I mean, 'cause he was here in Minnesota for a while too. It's just, you know,
Absolutely.
he was,
Yeah.
you know,
He was born and he died in Minnesota.
yeah.
Yeah.
So, one of the things, talking about the LA scene, and just kind of from the musician standpoint, I thought, first of all, I thought that you did, you know, I had heard about, you know, I have family in LA, you know, lived in LA for a long time, about the Central Avenue. I mean, it's kind of legendary, and it may be more romantic in some people's minds because it's not there anymore. But for me, I thought you really captured the feeling of what I imagined it to be. And for you guys, George and Ron, you probably have more experience to that. But it was a time when there was a section that was actually musicians were playing, and obviously we don't have that right now. But you had a place that you could go to work. How was that? Did you guys feel about that?
Well, I lived in LA, but after that time, but to hear about Central Avenue and how important that was to the music, how important that was to jazz, because in those days, you know, they were segregated. There was the union, the Black Union. There was a union at 47, that where the headquarters was on. What street was that? I can't remember, but it was in Hollywood, I think on Vine Street. And there were the musicians who played on Central Avenue. The Black musicians had their thing. And I mean, some white musicians, Art Pepper would try, and who I played with as well, would be try to be a part of that. But I think he felt some kind of draft from some of the musicians, or at least he perceived it to be that way. And there was some of that because a lot of the Black musicians were left out. I mean, they were kind of marginalized by that thing. But I met Frank in LA. And someone approached me, I can't remember who it was, approached me about playing with this guy, Frank Morgan. I heard his name, but I didn't really know much about him. He was wanted to do something at an artist collective in Santa Monica. And I think I had done something with Art Pepper, done duets with Art Pepper. So Frank wanted to do duets out there. So I go out there to do duets. That's how we met. And, you know, one thing or another, we'd have some days Frank would be a little late, but because, you know, he had to kind of get his thing together. Still, I think it was a struggle for Frank, because he would be incarcerated and he'd get out, but it was difficult for him to get away from life that he'd been living so long. So that was, I think, closer to the end of that major struggle. But we get together and play some music. We had fun, and we get together again, and then there's a period of time we didn't see each other. But that was the beginning of our relationship. And over the years, you know, we maintained that. We did at least one duet record and others. And playing duet with Frank, actually, I got to say, was easier for me. It's a very personal thing. It's different from playing with a rhythm section, because it's just you and the horn. When you guys are playing together, it's a duet. But when the horn stops, it's a solo. It was a person. I say it's easier for me because Frank had a tendency of I think he had a band in his head. He spent a lot of time away from the scene. So when he's thinking about music, that band that he would have had when he was on the outside had to be in his head, aside from the band in San Quentin, that big band. So he knew what he wanted to hear. It was like specific here. So he would kind of get on, he was not easy. He was a bit of a taskmaster. And so he would give dirty looks to the bass player, to the piano player, to the drummer, or say something. So everybody was kind of on pins and needles, trying to do the right thing, do this. So the music would suffer. And it was, you go home and your hair is falling out. So playing duet with Frank was really fun because it's just, the two of you. So there's no problem.
Do you think, talking about the racial aspects of sort of and Frank's demons, which we know he obviously had, you think a lot of his demons came from the racial oppression that is in America, but some of it's really directed towards musicians? I mean, yeah, Ron, you had talked about the union scenarios. I know LA was notorious, and I know New York was notorious. We should talk about that, because I think that has a lot to do with it. I mean, what you were making, the restrictions, the possibility of not wanting to play, but then you needed to play because it's how you basically survive. That sometimes drives people, that type of depression, that type of stress, that type of aggravation drives people in another direction.
Well, I didn't know Frank like everybody else seems to have known him, in New York, he was known as a hell of an alto player who couldn't stay the heck out of jail. That's kind of tag had in New York. So here, this guy's a guy named Frank Morgan, who's a bad MF man, but he can't keep his silly ass out of the joint. And getting to New York and want to be a jazz player, that's the story you hear about the musician, that you make a statement of what's the attraction, so to speak. Why does he keep doing that? When I finally met him, he did a record for Orange Keep News, and Frank got there. He looked great. He's clean. He had his horn. He had his horn. He had a concept he wanted to work, and then all of a sudden he would disappear and come back a half hour later or so. And Oren didn't quite know what to tell the band because he didn't know everybody knew Frank's proclivity for disappearing when he felt like it. Ultimately, he came back and we had a nice musical relationship. But I never knew him other than those times on the bandstand. But his reputation got to New York before he finally did.
Mm.
I think it was on a lot of musicians. I mean, Sonny Rock. I mean, there's this desire. The escape, and what I'm working towards is obviously heroin becomes something, okay, in a lot of jazz musicians' life. Does that come from the need to escape? Is it a need to leave the stress? Is it a need to,
I can't know that. If to follow that train of thought, one of the reasons certain musicians left New York for Europe was that the racial scene was so difficult for them to work that they felt to go to Paris, and they're famous. They can work every night they want in Paris, or Stockholm, or Berlin. So they're released from the pressure of being an Afro-American jazz player in New York. The solution for some of those guys was to get on the plane and go to London or go to Paris or go to and a lot of them did that, man, because they could be them, and people welcomed them and their efforts on playing this music, and they felt that they weren't getting that, let alone not in the States, just in the States, but not in New York of all places, those who didn't get that far, they had a different solution. Unfortunately, that solution was detrimental to their health and their spirit and everything else, their life. It's a tragedy to see that hasn't changed a whole lot. It's been disguised more. But the fact that an African American becomes famous singing opera in Berlin and is not so relegated to only singing Porgy and Bess in Europe, like he seems to be in the States, he or she, that's still the case. I think they have found other avenues for their talent that makes it not necessary to leave the boundaries of the United States to see where they can earn a living and be quote unquote more famous.
You were going to say something, George?
Yeah, I think it's all of those things that you mentioned. You threw a lot of stuff in the pot, and I think it's all of those things. But I think what Frank would tell you is that the thing that got him interested in heroin was the fact that his idol, he heard that his idol did heroin, so he did that. He thought that was, and there were a lot of young people, a lot of other musicians that heard that Bird did that. So they said, well, that might be a thing to do, or maybe I could play better, or for whatever other reasons. Now, that's not the only thing that's happening. Ron, I think, spoke volumes about what African American musicians and jazz musicians had to do to be accepted, for the music to be listened to, or them to be accepted as human beings, as people. There's a lot of that, but I think in this world, it's not a black and white world. There's a lot of gray area. There's a lot of different influence, a lot of factors in what happens. But everything that you kind of mentioned when you were posing your question is a part of that.
Yeah, Charlie Parker. He's obviously he was a great musician and everything, but he had this power, because I worked with Art Pepper, and that idea that Charlie and heroin was so connected, and everybody was, it's like in search of the Holy Grail. It's like they wanted, if he did it, it must be the key. There's the key, and he's got the key. And I just, to me, I never quite understood that. I never understood how they felt that Charlie's addiction created him. It's
It's
Well,
just like baseball players chew snuff because Ted Williams or whoever the star was at the time had smoked that big chaw in his mouth, and he'd go to the plate and spit it out and hit the ball 400 feet. That's enough to have someone be impressed if that's how you want to spend your life, and if it takes that step to make you get out of the minors to the majors, that I don't mean keys, minor league to the major league. People are looking for a solution, man, because it's not made so easily for them, and again, I can't respond to the addiction of it all, but one of the reasons, like George said, the environment was so conducive to finding a way to find yourself, since they wouldn't let you find yourself on your own terms.
Yeah. Grace, you were around Frank a lot. What is your response to his ultimate addiction? Because that was part of his issues. He was a career criminal. I get everybody else. He was a career criminal, but the drug aspect of it was part of that.
Yeah, well, the first time that I fell in love with Frank Morgan's music, as when I was first starting saxophone, I remember hearing those beautiful live recordings at the Jazz Standard and wearing it out. Learning literally note by note his solo on Round Midnight. To this day, I still love to play that intro the way he did, and never, ever imagining that I get to meet him, and certainly, have a really close relationship with him. But by the time I met him, I was 13 first when I met him in 2006. He was performing at the Scullers Jazz Club in Boston, and I got to just shake his hand and tell him how much a fan I was. And it wasn't until later when George introduced me to Frank again, and then he said to me, hey, when you guys were back performing in Boston, where I grew up, he said, hey, do you have your horn with you? And I happened to have my horn, and he said, come play the second set. My heart was beating like a mile a minute. And then the next week he called me and said, why don't you come play at the Pabst Theater with us in Milwaukee? What are you doing next week? And then it was, hey, why don't come, we're playing at the Jazz Standard for 10 nights. And it was like, these incredible pinch me moments. The Frank that I met, he was this incredibly, like, super beautiful, peaceful, loving, zen, this guy that I just felt such a connection with. And I didn't know, I learned so much when I was watching the documentary, which NC just did such an incredible job, showing us so many facets of his life. And I didn't get to talk to him about a lot of those things because he didn't bring it up. But one thing he did talk to me a lot, as you were talking, George, about Charlie Parker and him idolizing Charlie Parker. I remember one moment when I was so nervous. I was about to perform with the Boston Pops Orchestra, and I remember calling Frank, before that, being like, I don't know how I should play this. And he was actually thinking of coming down and seeing the performance. He wasn't able to, but he just gave me this word of encouragement on the phone. He said, you just play like the best Grace Kelly you can play. He's like, that's all you need to do. And he told me stories of how much anxiety he felt, being named the next Charlie Parker. And without going into detail of what that meant, he was able to pass on this incredible encouragement to me at that point of his life. And he said, you just go out there and you be yourself, and it's that memory literally of us on the phone and him telling me that is just trickling in my head as George was talking about that. But yeah, I met Frank, I think he was a very different Frank at
It's
that
probably,
point.
I think it's part of, this is a song of redemption. This is part of what this is about. And I think that he made those choices in his life. I have a question for George from one of our viewers. It says, you played with both Art and Frank, and how would you compare their styles?
Well, both of them loved playing ballads. Art was a real master ballad player. He had a philosophy that, he would drill into you. He would never let you forget that way. And that is, when you play a ballad, just play slow. Don't double up. And I remember Tony Dumas, a wonderful bassist, was playing, we were playing together. We played a passing note. And after the song, I said, don't ever do that again. And Tony said, but I was, and that was just a passing note. So it was really about just don't, you get a chance to bounce on the other pieces you're going to play. So we want to play this just a ballad. And Frank, I don't think wasn't so maybe rigid about that, but he wanted to play. He was could be a little syrupy in a way. He was, he loved playing a ballad, loved playing melody. Melody was very, very important to him. Art maybe would like to venture somewhere else, I think. But there was something while you were speaking that I would like to say, a couple of things. Just going back, now if you said Frank was, heard that Bird did heroin, but when he told Bird that he was doing heroin, Bird was not happy. Bird was not happy that Frank was doing it. It's something that he did, but he didn't want him to do it. So it's not something that he encouraged. And the other thing is, we've been throwing around terms like drug addict and heroin addict, and career criminal. Some of those terms seem to dehumanize anybody, dehumanize people. But still, the thing about what I think the film does really well is that it brings back the focus on Frank's humanity and Frank's who he is. Because once you use those terms, those other terms like addict and criminal, all of a sudden that could be anybody. It has nothing to do with who you are. And I think when we visited the prison, all those people there had done something. But when we spent time with them, we saw them as human beings. It could have been somebody that lived next door or walked down the street or was working in the store that we had gone to. So there's one of the things that I think the film was strong on it. It showed the Frank as a human being. And as we speak about Frank, and as Grace speaks about Frank and about what he meant to her and what he did for her and their relationship, that really puts in the focus that anybody can be a lot of things. Still
I think you're right. I mean, I think that's what NC did really, really well. Is that, I mean, again, I go back to the title of the film, you know, it's about redemption. You got to go one way in order to be redeemed from that way. And I think that is in the film. You see this, and he says it in the film. He's going to do all he can to not do these things again. And I think that Grace is a very good touchstone, I think, for taking Frank into the future and his inspiration into the future. I think that's really important. One of the characters in the film, and again, NC and I talked about Rosalinda, and her is a character, and again, it's like to a certain extent, you know, you were rooting for her the whole time to, like, you know, just turn around, Frank, and look at her. She's there. You know, you wanted him to do that. You wanted him to understand. And I know every relationship is difficult and challenged, but I thought that even being there to the end was commendable for her to do that. And her real true love for this gentleman was there.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, she's a class act, Rosalinda. She's really an extraordinary person. And I just love that she approached this with that innocence of love that, I mean, we all, when we're, you know, in our 20s, think that love conquers all. And it doesn't conquer heroin addiction. That's the thing that is so hard and heartbreaking about addiction like that. But she was just wonderful, and she did turn him around for quite a long time. And I want to go back to this idea of humanity. I think that was the thing that just blew us all away so much about going into San Quentin, because we had this preparation from the warden that was all about what's going to happen if somebody tries to take one of you hostage. And if you hear a whistle blow, you have to drop down to the ground and don't wear blue because you could get shot. And it was like, you know, and we were so nervous going in. We were so hyped about this highly volatile, dangerous, full of violent criminal place that we're going into. And instead, we meet these very nice, very polite, calm people who were human beings. All you could see when they were listening to music was humanity. You did not see prisoners, you saw humanity and their humanity. And, you know, it was a big eye opener, I think, for all of us, and a heart opener that I hope carried through in the film. I know certainly we experienced it live, but it was something that had a lasting effect on me, for sure, to humanize these guys who are not, they're just not convicts. They're just not their crime. They're more than that. Everyone is more than one thing.
Yeah, I mean, this wasn't a prison movie. I mean, it was about these people. And I think it's the selection that of images, you know, during the concert, you know, sort of radiated that. You know, that they were human beings, that they were just an audience. Once you got past the fact that you were in San Quentin, let's put it that way, once the audience got past that, you actually just saw these as people watching this concert. And what I loved about it, there was an unquiet or a quiet thrill that they had by listening to this music and being there. I mean, it was almost like you gave them a gift, you know, by doing the concert there for them, you know, and it's a really beautiful thing to see, you know.
It was great. I mean, it was hard to get in there, you know. It's not easy to go well, now because of COVID, it's totally impossible, but it's still, anytime is not easy to get permission to go into a prison and do something like this. It took us like 14 months to finally get it together. So they don't make it easy, but you can see the reward is huge. It's just huge. It's just too bad it can't happen more often.
Yeah, this beautiful thing, beautiful thing. Is Rosalinda, she's still around? Is she still with us, or is she?
Oh yeah, she may
okay.
even be online.
you got everybody online, right? Everybody you know.
Definitely, she lives in Taos.
Oh, okay. Oh, okay.
No, she lives in Santa Fe. Excuse me.
Yeah, just cool. I want to, one of the things I wanted to talk about briefly here is for each of you, I know what I feel is the redemption of Frank, because we all go through life and we all, the runner stumbles, we all fall down and we get back up. But I wanted to ask you guys what you felt kind of was the sort of the redeeming factor of Frank in his life. Do you want to try this, Ron?
Given Frank's tendency to end up locked up a good deal of his life, his desire to still play with other people and make them a part of his music. That's really fascinating to me. I know he spent time in solitary and all that stuff that goes on inside the walls, but when he was free of his desire to play with a band of guys whose only interest was making great music. And how could he help that process by playing what he played? That's really fascinating, given his background and how often he was how often he was in a place where no matter how good the guys were in prison, they weren't like being free with the other on the scene, And I was always so sorry that Frank got the tag of the guy who plays great. He stays in the joint because Frank played great. It's probably over my head to understand that clear difference in is and isn't, free and not free. But Frank was a wonderful alto player. He could have played forever if he felt like, in terms of gigs and acclaim, I thought, But he found a different way to make those downtimes take him into some other lifestyle, But when he was out, his desire to play with guys and make them sound good by his alto solo was just fascinating to me.
That's great. Grace, what do you think?
Well, I mean, I feel very, very lucky to have learned so much from Frank. He was an amazing teacher, and I know a lot of people might not know that, and I feel very grateful to be one who really got to study with him, and in just so many moments we spent together, whether it was stories he would tell me or whether it was playing at the Jazz Standard, and he'd have me up for the whole set and we'd play some monk tunes, and after he'd look at me and say, you need to use more rhythm and we got to relook at that, just these moments that have shaped my musicianship. And whenever I'm teaching someone else, it's like his words and my mentors, they're ringing in my head. And he was also, he did a little bit of teaching at the Brubeck Jazz Colony when we knew each other as well. And I remember that was, and it was actually through my family that connection was made to bring him in as a faculty member. And I remember how happy and joyous he was to be teaching, to be around all these young students, like telling his stories. Just, he was, absolutely just so happy to be there. And the students were just like, hanging on his every word and every note. And so, he brought so much to us and this generation coming up now. And I feel just very, very lucky to have studied, right with the man himself.
Michael, what do you think?
Craig, I think you hit on it earlier. I think Grace is the redemption of Frank Morgan. He had a message towards the end of his life, and I think he passed that on to Grace, and he passed it on to some other people, and they carry it on. I think this film came out of a plan he had. He asked me once to take him to Berkeley School of Music in Boston so he could talk to the kids, and he knew Grace had gone there. so we went, and he did a couple of master classes about musicianship, but he talked to a general assembly of students and revealed his story. And, you know, no holds barred, told how bad it was when he was very badly addicted in the things he did. And, you know, and it had an impact on the kids, just as I'm sure it had an impact on Grace. It wasn't just about the musicianship he passed on to Grace. I think it was about the life of a musician and how it should be now. And I think that's the lasting thing. You know, when we went to the airport the next day, he said, let's do it again. Let's go to the music school at University of Indiana. He says, that's where I want to go next. And he got sick, and it never happened. And that's why I went to NC and said, there might be a film in this because there is a message. But, you know, when I watch the film and I see Grace play Somewhere Over the Rainbow, I just feel that's Frank's redemption.
Right. George.
Well, I have to agree with Michael and Grace. I think what you guys were saying, I think the ultimate redemption is Grace and those people who are young people who are benefiting from his knowledge and from what he passed on. But I think also his redemption is not having to go back, not going back to prison, and also breaking that relationship with heroin. So I think all of those things are his redemption.
And see, this film, you constructed a story that I think is really powerful. What do you feel, other than what you put down on film here?
About Frank's redemption?
Mm-hmm. Yes.
I hear it in his music. And, you know, most of the albums came out after he finally left prison for good. And I just hear it in the music all the time. I agree that Grace's, you know, personifies his redemption, but he did it for himself too. I mean, he did, like George said, he turned his back on the drug finally, and made incredible music. And I felt like when we went into San Quentin and told his story and played his music, there was like redemption all over the place in that moment of of him being, all those guys being able to connect to him and his story and his music was another way that he had some redemption. I have to say the whole redemption thing comes from Mike, who, when we started talking about this, he said, well, I always thought that the only good stories are stories that have redemption in them. So this was, you know, he says he stepped back and he didn't do anything, but that's not quite true. You know, there was like a definite philosophical and emotional train that Mike was into, and that really helped me. And so it all became about how do you redeem somebody who's been down so low? Well, they redeem themselves. If they don't redeem themselves, it's hard to make the story. But I think that Frank redeemed himself, and we have all that beautiful music to prove it, and to enjoy, and to remember all the time. Every time you hear a note, you hear it.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that you created a great film, and you know, the sound of his soul is something that you hear in his music, and I think it was magnificent. And I really want to, first of all, I want to thank all of y'all for coming on here. I really do. You know, Ron, Grace, NC, George, and Michael for doing this with us. I appreciate it. I want to thank the audience, because this doesn't work and there's an audience out there to listen to us talk, or we just be hanging out. You know, I want to thank Penny and Bill George Foundation, Kelly and Mike Palmer and Knock. And I want to thank everybody. If you're looking for this, we recorded this. It'll be on mspfilm.org. So that's mspfilm.org if you want to tell your friends and want to see the Facebook version of this. But again, it's a wonderful film. I wish you guys all the best. And I really am excited that we had an opportunity to do this. And thank you all for doing this, and have a good night. Enjoy. And stay safe and healthy. We can't forget where we are in the world right now, okay? Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye. Thank you
Bye,
for
everybody.
inviting us.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.